Well, y'all, it's my favorite time of year. Fall. I love the fall. And truthfully, we're kind of like past the high point of fall where the colors are just spectacular. The weather actually has been pretty amazing. So the weather is great. But like all this behind me here was just vivid with reds and yellows and oranges and just spectacular here the last couple weeks. And I did get some video, which I'm going to try to attach to this. But a lot of that has since passed. But I am in awe of the fall. I love it. I think I had a friend of mine making fun of me the other day because she's not so much of a fan because the weather is getting cooler, less time at the lake, you know, those things. But there's just something about this time of year that just makes me go, ah. And yes, I always have a cup of coffee with me in the fall. In fact, I drink way too much coffee this time of year, and I'm okay with that because I just love snuggling up, whether it's at the table with the kids doing school or for a movie night or a good book at the end of the day or crocheting when we have a break, whatever it is, with a cup of hot something, whether it's coffee or tea. I just love this time of year. But I thought I would come out and just kind of update you on kind of things that have been going on out here. Not much, a little bit, not much. But there are some things I thought would be interesting to share with you guys. And actually I thought for the most part for this video, I will be telling you the things I will be doing differently next year. Well, you're staring at my west garden here, which is where all my cabbages and my cauliflowers and my peppers, sweet potatoes, the potatoes that grew back there this past year. And right now I have some lettuces growing. I still have lots of Brussels sprouts that I can come out and harvest from. I have a whole bunch of mustard greens here that we harvested from a couple days ago, and then they've already grown back. And I did plant some sort of broccolis in here, but I don't think they're going to come up. I just think they're getting eaten by a little bunny that's running amok. But that's okay. That's okay. We still have tons of parsley. I just harvested some cabbage the other day, and I still have more cabbages coming to a head in here that I can harvest here and there. The Brussels sprouts have been great. And like I said, the lettuces are finally coming in so we can have fresh salad. Now, this garden is still very much in use compared to my other garden, which I'll show you in a second, because I have a lot of my fall crops in here. Kale, I'm looking at some kale right now that we've been harvesting on for months, and some herbs that are still in here, my rosemary, oregano, parsley, chives, all of that's still in here. But one thing that I'm going to be doing differently next year is just the way that I orient my gardens. So right now I'm looking at you, which I'm facing east, and behind me is west. And all the beds in this garden are oriented north-south. So I have beds going along this side that are going north-south this way. I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 8 beds going this way. And then 8 beds behind me oriented north-south with this walkway down the middle. And that was fine. That worked well for what I was doing this year. But as I've been doing some reading and just trying to figure out the most efficient way to garden with what I'm trying to do, a pretty sizable amount of food that I'm trying to grow, I took some tips from Justin Rhodes. I don't know if you've heard of him, if you know him. Whoops, that wasn't smart. But he's a great guy to follow, especially if you're have any interest at all in homesteading or just getting better at gardening. But one of the things that he suggested that I thought was genius is when you're doing your garden beds, especially if you're doing crop gardens, to size them according to what most garden supplies come in. Now, what does that mean? He was talking about covering your gardens up for the winter with silage tarps, or using row covers if you're trying to grow crops through the fall and the winter. And most of those are about 30 to 36 inches wide and 50 to 100 feet long. So this garden bed is about that. It's a little over or under 50 foot. I'd have to remeasure. And so, but that would mean that I would need to orient my gardens on an east-west orientation, which is what I did in my tomato gardens, going east-west, which is actually better for the way that the sun will hit your garden. If I'm thinking of how to best utilize my garden supplies and resources, especially if I'm wanting to grow a lot of something, it makes a lot more sense to have long, narrow garden beds that I can lay one long piece of whatever, whether it's, again, silage tarp, row covers, or maybe even it's the weed matting, biodegradable weed matting I want to lay down to be able to really help with the weed burden next year. So, number one thing I'm going to be doing differently in this garden in particular is I am going to basically tear down all these garden beds and reorient them to go along this way, north-south. So that would probably give me, I'd have to do the measurements, but if I'm just looking at this, it'll be probably 3 long beds over here and 2 to 3 long beds behind me, again, with still one walkway down the center. And really that'll be great, because one of the other things that I decided that I wanted to do differently next year is keep more of the same kind of plants together. I've always been very much like a companion planter, and I still will be that, but I'm just seeing how much more efficient it is for time and harvest to keep like things together. One thing in particular that ended up being a major problem for harvesting this year was sweet potatoes, and I will get to that. But for example, next year when I do garlic, onions, regular potatoes, sweet potatoes, whatever it is, I want to have them all in one nice big long row, because it'll be a lot easier to plant, a lot easier to keep up with what is planted, and then also for harvesting sakes. So I may still plant maybe like herbs around the edges, or interplant onions and certain things to keep rabbits away. But for the most part, I'm going to try to keep like plants together. And I really think, again, that's going to help with remembering what I've planted. It's going to be a lot more efficient for planting out plants or seeds. And then when it comes to harvest, just knowing that whole row will be harvested at a certain amount of time, or half a row, however much I end up planting. Yeah, that won't really be a big deal when it comes to tearing this garden down, because most of this will just die down and become compost, and then we'll cover the whole thing with a tarp. And then come spring, what we'll do is we'll pull the tarp back, we'll set our beds. So we'll kind of measure them out and get them set by putting compost or straw or whatever to mark them, or rock for the edges. And then we'll lay the tarp back over until we're ready to plant the actual plants. And I really think that's just going to make everything a lot more efficient. I think it'll be helpful to view from this vantage point to see what I'm talking about. So I've got the center aisle here, which is kind of wonky because all these Brussels sprouts have fallen through the middle. But I'll have a center aisle here, and then I'll have 1, 2, possibly 3 long beds going east-west, because that's west, and then 1, 2, 3 east-west. Now I can have one whole crop in this long 50-foot bed, and that would be for things like onions, garlic, potatoes, plants like that I need to plant a lot of to get a harvest. But then for things like Brussels sprouts, I don't need a 50-foot long row of Brussels sprouts. I have a ton of Brussels sprouts right now, and it's more than we can eat. Like, I need people to come harvest this for me. So for things like Brussels sprouts, I won't need a whole 50-foot bed. I could use maybe a third of it or a half of it for that. For things like cabbages, broccolis, where you have one plant per item, those are things that would be really great to grow in one long row, because you only get one cabbage head from one plant. Whereas from a Brussels sprout plant, you get hundreds of Brussels sprouts per one plant. Does that make sense? And then for my really big sprawling plants, my pumpkins and my winter squash, those will all grow out here. And whether it's in a row or not, I'm not too concerned about it because they sprawl so much, it doesn't really make a difference. But you can see this whole field that our chickens basically created for us this past year, all this green, this was all brush. See all that brush that's back there? This whole entire area, the garden and all of this was brush when we moved here a year ago. But thanks to the chickens, they have cleared all this and made it a really nice pasture that I can plant in the spring. So I'm really excited about that. Okay, this is probably thing number 3 I'm gonna do differently. This is such a disappointment, but I kind of had a lot of grace with myself on this because I've never grown sweet potatoes before. But I would say I had an okay harvest. I probably could have had a lot more sweet potatoes, but what I did wrong, and this is probably someone would tell me it's a rookie mistake, and I'm a rookie when it comes to growing sweet potatoes. I grew two different areas. In this bed, I grew along this fence line, one type of sweet potato. I think it was the Beauregard, I'd have to look. Purple skin, white interior. It was a Japanese sweet potato. So whatever that one was. And the ones that grew were a great size. They were a great potato. I did not get very many. But here is where the problem lied. My original thinking was I was going to grow it on this fence line to save space since I pretty much had all of these beds dedicated to other things. And I thought that the sweet potato vines would grow up the fence line and be a really pretty backdrop to all of this, or it would just go over the fence lines and be pretty from the outside in. That did not happen. The sweet potato vines grew out this way. They were all intertangled, and all the things that I had planted in here, like this huge raspberry plant that grew that was really difficult to harvest around when it came time to harvesting. I planted a bunch of blueberry plants in here. I just wasn't quite putting all of this together in my mind when I did this. So I'm pretty sure the sweet potato plants choked out all but one of my blueberry plants. And the hardest thing was that the plants grew under the fence line. So I was having to dig down under the fence, and they were stuck where I couldn't get them out. Or I would have had to go to the other side where I've got turf and dig that way. And by that point, I was so exasperated. I was like, forget it. I'm not even gonna mess with it. Just note to self for next year, I need to grow my sweet potatoes in a bed, a dedicated bed, without a structure that they would get stuck under, like a fence or a trellis or something like that. And one other thing that I learned is that they break really easily. And so if the dirt is too hard and you're trying to pull it up out of the dirt, it'll just break in half. And when you're trying to shovel down and figure out where they are, too often you're shoveling right into the sweet potato and ruining it and chopping it in half. That was not the case for the regular potatoes. Regular potatoes, you can almost just pull up by the plant and get all the potatoes. They don't break easily. So you can just dig around them and dig them up. Super easy to harvest regular potatoes, red, purple, white, gold, whatever, in the same kind of dirt that it was really difficult to harvest sweet potatoes in. So don't grow them near a fence. Grow them in their own dedicated bed. And I would say the other thing is make sure the soil is super loose and easy to move around, because they broke and they were really difficult to get out of the soil because of that. And so I lost a lot of them. A lot of them I've had to cook immediately because they were either broken or the shovel got into them because we were trying to get the soil loosened around them to get them out. So I hope that makes sense. But if you haven't grown sweet potatoes before and want to, those would be my hot tips. Get them in the ground as soon as you can in the spring, because they take a long time to develop, a long time. So while I had a lot of really nice sized ones, there were a lot of small ones because I just didn't get them in the ground soon enough. And then just make sure your soil is really nice and loose. And you can do that by adding sand to your soil, because that'll help keep it loose, by adding compost, making sure there's worms in there. And I'm forgetting one other thing you can add to the soil to help it to be looser. But those are things that I definitely will change next year. And I definitely will not be planting plants like that sprawl among my berry plants, because I think they kind of suffered for it. The other thing is I'll probably be moving these berry plants outside of the garden, because they're taking up precious space in here that could be used for something else, and they're not going to be bothered here outside of the garden fence. I've already mentioned this in a couple other videos, but just since this is the topic of the day, I'm going to be moving almost all of my ornamental flowers outside of the garden. They're beautiful. I enjoyed them, but I couldn't enjoy them as much as I wanted to inside the garden as I would have outside the garden, where I can view them coming in on my driveway or am I sitting or from the house. And they're taking up space for vegetables that need to be protected by a fence. So all of my zinnias, most of my sunflowers, things like that, I'm going to grow outside of the garden bed. Now, I may still have marigolds in here and nasturtiums because they provide that benefit to the plants, but honestly, I could still grow those outside of the garden and they would probably be even more beneficial. And here's why: because they're attracting the bugs that I'm trying to keep away from my plants. So I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but if you're planting like nasturtiums and marigolds near the plants that you're trying to protect, all you're doing is inviting that pest to your flower, which is right next to the plant you're trying to protect. If you can actually move those plants away from your squash or whatever it is you're trying to protect, those bugs will go elsewhere instead of being right where your plant is. I hope I'm being clear on that. Originally, when I first started learning about companion planting, I would plant my nasturtiums and my marigolds right next to the plant that it was supposed to protect. But all that was doing was drawing the pests to the flower, which were planted right next to the squash. So plant them away from the things they're trying to protect, unless having them right next to that plant benefits them. Like it's a scent that it's putting off to deter pests from that plant. Like a lot of your herbs, your oregano, your rosemary, your thyme, the scent and the perfume they put off repels the insects from the nearby plants. That's different. If they're actually repelling a plant, then you want to have those near your precious fruits and vegetables. But for the case of nasturtiums in particular, insects are actually more attracted to that flower than they are your plant. So if they can find that flower, then that's where they'll go first, and that'll keep them away from the plant you're trying to protect. As far as sunflowers go, I had all of them inside the bed, and I think my original thought was that the deer would eat them, and they may still. And really, my sunflowers that were on the back fence line here, they were not too much of a problem, but they grew so fast that they kind of drowned out like my cucumbers that I were trying to grow. So I think I'm going to try to grow a nice thick line of sunflowers on the outside of my garden, and that way the outside ones might get eaten by the deer, but the inside ones will be okay. I'm just going to try it, and if it doesn't work, then I'll know for the future, and I may still grow a few on the inside corners or like middle, things like that, so that they're not taking up my whole garden bed. But they sure were beautiful. I want to make sure I have lots of sunflowers, if not even more, next year, because they were just a gorgeous backdrop to the whole garden. So definitely a win with all the big sunflowers this year. One of the cool things that we recently did was we finally gave our egg-laying chickens their own permanent coop. Isn't it cute? My husband built this, so proud of him, and it really has been my dream coop, which sounds silly to say, but after following and having chickens for the past, I think 3 years now, I really learned what, thank you, Jacques, I really learned what I wanted in a coop and why those particular things were important. And I can show you that later on another video. But what I want to show you is the placement of this coop. So right here is the compost that I established when we moved here. And that played a really important role to where I put my garden and where we put the coop and the chicken run. So here we're on the east side of my garden bed. This is the east garden. We were way over there on the west garden. And I am standing in the current chicken run. So the reason that I did this was it's a permaculture idea of having the chickens work for your garden and your garden work for your chickens. So this is my compost. They've been in here turning this, and all of this is ready to be shoved into, literally scooped from here and raked into there for next year's garden. The other thing that came in really handy was I have an opening here from their run into the garden, and an opening here from their run into my pumpkin garden. And the idea behind that was this. Now I can let them in here now that everything's done, and they've been scratching around and manuring all over this garden bed for the last few weeks and basically prepping this for next year. They have laid waste almost every piece of green that is in here, which is great. So they're chopping down the weeds, they're eating the plants that were left over. They're tilling it with their feet and their claws, and that is going to be really helpful preparation for next year's garden. This looks completely different than over there, which is great because they have just done their work in this 3,000 square foot space. The thing that I'll be doing differently in this garden is making sure the whole garden is, again, the east-west orientation. What I had my tomatoes. So my tomatoes started from that end and came all the way to here. But then I had all my onions and garlic going from north to south. And that was fine. It really was fine for what it was. But it makes so much more sense to do the whole thing, all these long straight rows that I can access from either point, either end of the garden and the middle, going up and down if I need to be able to what am I trying to say? It'll be a lot more efficient to be able to access the different garden beds, to know exactly what's planted, and again, to use garden resources that you can buy that come in 50 foot or longer, usually 50 foot or 100 foot long tarps and such. So that's not going to be a big deal to do. In fact, I could leave these fences here if I want to over the winter and then just extend them in the spring. And then there's this space behind me. We'll just do the same thing and have all of this room right here for whatever I decide to plant. And once the snow comes, the chickens will pretty much be done coming in here. So I can just close up the gate behind me and they won't need to be in here anymore. So this is kind of like a paddock system where I can open up whatever paddock I want them to be in, depending on what's growing or not growing or what I need them to prep or not prep. So they'll still have this whole huge run behind me once I close up the space. But it's been really awesome to have them in here working this. And there's still things that need to be done. Like I can be pulling out these zinnias behind me, pulling out some of these more stocky type plants that are left over. Or I could just leave them for the winter. But if we want to lay down a tarp, I really need to get rid of all the stuff that's kind of above the ground so that we can flatly lay a tarp. So there's still stuff like that, but that would not take very long for us to come out and do. They've done such a good job just taking care of this as it is. So all these stocky plants, I'm not going to leave them in the garden because they won't break down by the time I'm ready to plant next year. But I will just throw them over into the chicken run because over time they will break down. The other thing we're doing is I have a whole huge pile of wood chips, and those wood chips are going to be going in the chicken run. My goal is to have 4 to 8 inches of wood chips from ground up that will eventually turn into compost. So their whole run will eventually have 4 to 8 inches of wood chips in them that they will be constantly manuring on and turning with their feet. That's where I'll throw all my food scraps. What was that? That's where I'll throw all my food scraps and basically, basically their run will become a living compost, the entire run. And what do I get to do with that? I will take the compost from their run and throw it into the garden. And then anything in the garden that's spent, I will throw from the garden into the run. So it's like this back and forth thing that's happening. And that is the permaculture idea. So they're working for me and the garden's working for them, and it becomes a beautiful symbiosis. Permaculture in its finest. Chickens working over here, compost in the garden, stuff from the garden over to the chickens, and having them close by the house, close by the garage, and close by the garden makes it a really efficient system. And lastly, other things I'll do different this year. I've been fine-tuning what tomato plants I really feel like are best for me to grow. I grew a lot more of the canning type tomatoes this year and less of the ornamentals, although I still wanted to have some fun, tomato plants to grow. But I kept in mind like what were the purposes of them. We do a lot less fresh eating actually of the bigger tomatoes, but lots of fresh eating of the cherry tomatoes. And the ones that were definitely our favorites this year were the Sun Golds by far. We still love the Napa Chardonnays, the Mexico Midget. We were not a fan of the Berry's Crazy Cherry. What was the other one that we were just kind of okay? I'm not a huge fan of the Blueberry Cherry, and the Yellow Eagle Heart is good. It just didn't grow very well this year, so we didn't get a lot of those. But Sun Golds, Mexico Midget, and Napa Chardonnay are probably our 3 favorite cherry tomato varieties, so I will definitely keep those as our basic cherry tomato stock. And then as far as like the bigger tomatoes go, I've just had so much success with German pink, yellow, gold medal, Dr. Witchy's, the Amish paste, obviously Romas. I don't remember the other one, but those are ones that are really, really great for canning. And if you do want to do fresh eating, they're great slicers to put on a sandwich. But I still am just not a huge fan of what are known as the saladettes, which are the like 2 to 3 inch tomatoes. Those are more for fresh eating, which if you eat a lot of fresh tomatoes. But I just haven't found one that's flavor profile really makes me excited. So again, I think I'm really able to narrow down which tomato varieties I want to grow and how many of them I need to grow. Much less of the yellow and orange tomatoes and much more of the red tomatoes. I definitely have a use for yellow tomatoes. There's some things that I've enjoyed making, like yellow tomato jam or preserves and like chutneys. But the red ones are just like by far superior when it comes to canning. Now, on that note, I will not just grow paste tomatoes, and here's why. Because I love the combination of all the different flavors for the tomato products that I make. I love combining the German pinks and the Amish paste and the Romas and even like some of my yellow and orange tomatoes, because all together they make such a robust flavor profile versus just doing everything with Amish paste and everything with Romas. So I'm not just gonna grow those canning tomatoes. I still wanna have some variety of tomatoes that I know that grow really well to combine them to make all these really fun tomato products that I canned this past year. So I'm not going to turn my nose up to other varieties that come out. I know myself well enough to know that I'm still going to try some things that sound intriguing, but I have my tried and true tomatoes at this point nailed down. And so I'll be more discriminating moving forward on things that I'm going to try out and weed out, so that I'm not buying $50 worth of seeds every year. I saved a ton of seeds from the garden this year. I probably won't need to buy any unless there's a variety that I really like or a variety that I ran out of and wasn't able to get the seeds. And on that note, as far as peppers go, I felt like I had a pretty good pepper variety. Tons of cayenne, tons of serranos and jalapenos, which I was able to pickle a lot of those, dry a lot of those for like cayenne pepper flakes and the ground cayenne pepper. I want to do some more habaneros, like the actual spicy ones, to do some different habanero peach salsas and things like that. And less of the shishito peppers. Those were really good, but they're so abundant. I had way more than I needed. So less shishito peppers, but I really felt like the mix of hot spicy peppers I had worked really well. Also, still grow tons of bell peppers because they are not as prolific. You might have, anywhere from 4 to 15 per plant. So still will grow tons of bell peppers. King of the North, I picked up 2 new varieties this year that I'm really excited about. One is the Escamillo, I think is the name. It's a yellow bell pepper that tastes divine, and it's what I made the hot pepper mustard butter with. And then a red pepper called, Cavalier. That's not correct. I'll put it in the notes. But I got that from a local farmer, and that was the most amazing tasting red pepper I've ever had. And he grew it right here in Michigan. So I know that it'll grow well in my garden, and I saved those seeds so that I can grow them next year. So I think for now, that's pretty much what I'll do differently. I'm gonna grow a ton more garlic and onions, hopefully, because we use so much of those, and I ran out of them so fast. So I definitely want to dedicate a large portion of my garden to garlic, onions, corn, for sure, because those are things that we use a lot of. I want to grow more of the French style green beans than the flat style beans. Basically the French style green beans compared to like a dragon's tongue bean. I like the dragon tongue bean, but not as much as I like the long skinny ones that you can ferment, that you can, and that you can freeze really well. So I didn't have that much success with green beans this year, the long style green beans. So I really want to work to have a better system next year for green beans. And it may be growing less on the overhanging trellises and more on a trellis like this. We'll see. I have to think about it over the winter. I also want to grow more of beans for soups, like beans that you can dry and put in soups, because then that'll eliminate the need for me to go buy beans at the store, right? So I want to grow more of those. I definitely want to grow more variety of winter squash that I know that we'll eat. Some of those were hit or miss this year on their ability to thrive because of squash bugs. My pumpkins did great. I have plenty of pumpkins. I don't need to increase that, but I definitely need to increase my winter squash variety and how many plants I grow. As far as summer squash, that was amazing. I will definitely stick with the varieties I did. In fact, I even narrowed down that further to 2 types of patty pans that I really like and 1 or 2 types of zucchinis that I really like. So I know I don't have to grow as many of those next year. But I definitely need more sweet corn. I grew more than I had the year before, but I definitely need a whole field that I may grow among with the pumpkins of sweet corn. Definitely need more of that. So those are kind of the basics that I'm thinking. Sweet corn, beans, onions, potatoes, garlic. I want to do a different system with my sweet potatoes next year. Lots of bell peppers, about the same variety of spicy peppers, and just a more narrowed down tomato varieties. Otherwise, I feel like we were really successful. My cucumbers did not do very well this year. I hope to grow more cucumbers next year, but I have plenty of pickles to last me for the next year, so I'm not too worried about that. So anyway, that's what I'm thinking. Overall, really successful year. I have a really full pantry, and I still have a full freezer of things that I need to process, mainly tomatoes and tomatillas. But I guess I'll keep you updated with things out here as we get the garden shut down for the winter, and any plans that I make for the following year, I will be sure and load those up here on the forum. So enjoy your fall as much as I am, and we'll be in touch.